Very good afternoon to our members, speakers, and friends. On behalf of the SBF Free Trade Agreement Education Outreach Team, welcome to our virtual seminar on the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP for short. My name is Jason Lee, and I will be taking you through today's event. The CPTPP is an FTA among 11 countries, all of which are members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and therefore an important pathway to APEC's vision of a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. Against the current backdrop of trade tensions and anti-globalization sentiments, the CPTPP is a strong signal by its parties of their commitment to trade liberalization and a rules-based trading system. The CPTPP is an open and inclusive agreement which both Singapore and our businesses look forward to other like-minded parties joining. Today's agenda includes an overview of the CPTPP before two panel discussions. The first on the benefits of CPTPP for businesses, and the second on the future of CPTPP. Should you have any question, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and we will endeavor to address them if we are able to within the time we have. Otherwise, our FTA team will follow up with you over email after the event. So without further ado, let me pass the time to our Assistant CEO for Global Business, Darius Lim, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Jason. Dear distinguished speakers, valued partners, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And that brings together 11 parties in the Asia-Pacific region, complementing Singapore's existing network of FTAs and further deepening supply chain integration in the region. It is also Singapore's first FTA with Canada and Mexico. Having entered into force at the end of 2018 for Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, and Singapore, we are heartened that Vietnam and Peru have also completed their domestic processes to implement the CPTPP. Markets, leveraging on their existing regional supply chains. We welcome the negotiations on the UK's accession to the CPTPP and look forward to UK joining the agreement. Beyond tariff savings and regional accumulation, businesses have benefited from CPTPP's self-certification process, which has helped in reducing paperwork and increasing efficiency for the exports to CPTPP markets. Today, we have a great lineup of CPTPP experts, and I hope that you will gain a better understanding and discover how you can utilize this agreement to capture value for your business. On that note, I would like to encourage you to ask any questions you have during today's event. If you have any further Thank you once again, and I wish everyone a very fruitful webinar ahead.
Thank you, Darius. Toon Joon, Director of the International Trade Cluster at Ministry of Trade and Industry, will now share with us an overview of CPTPP. TJ oversees trade in goods, investment, APEC, and CPTPP issues at MTI. He is a senior and seasoned trade official, having been Director of the Emerging Markets Division, led on ASEAN services and investment issues, and was on post to WTO at Geneva in 1999 prior to his current role. May I now invite TJ, please?
Thanks very much, Jason, and good afternoon to all the attendees of this webinar. So for this session, I've been given 10 minutes. Given the number of participants, audiences, I would suggest, since not everybody is very familiar with the CPTPP, I would propose to do a quick overview of the CPTPP, as well as some of the benefits to businesses. And of course, that will then segue into the next panel, where the panelists will be talking about the benefits to businesses. Next slide, please. Right, so this is the outline of my 10-minute session overview, the benefits to businesses, and then of course looking ahead to Singapore's chairmanship of the CPTPP Commission next year. Next, please. Right, so the CPTPP is actually a free trade agreement comprising 11 parties. I think Darius touched on this earlier in his opening as well. Right now, only 8 parties have ratified the agreement. So the agreement has come into force for 8, except 3, and they are Malaysia, Brunei, as well as Chile. So for them, they will have to ratify the agreement first before the agreement will come into effect for them. For Singapore, this actually marks the first FTA that we have with Canada as well as Mexico. And for these 2 economies, it will cover actually 99% as well as 88% of our exports to their markets. And in 2020, actually, the CPTPP economies accounted for about 22% of our total trade in goods. And of course, as we see more parties joining, more signatories, the benefits, of course, will increase for our businesses. Thanks. So if you look at the CPTPP itself, it is a very comprehensive free trade agreement, high standards, often regarded as a 21st century FTA. It covers 30 chapters in total. These are some of the highlights in terms of the different elements of the CPTPP. The 3 kind of like we categorize them into 3 different pillars. One is of course talking about comprehensive market access. And this covers goods, services, investment, government procurement. The other pillar is really about updated rules in traditional areas such as rules of origin, customs, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, TBT. The third pillar is really talking about the more sort of 21st century issues, which is also about addressing emerging business challenges. And here we are talking about e-commerce, environment, IPR, labor, as well as state-owned enterprises. The next part, I'll try to go quickly into some of the key benefits. Then, of course, there are questions the next panel could probably address some. When we talk about trade in goods, for example, the CPTPP will actually cover 100% of the goods traded, and over 90% of it will be tariff-free upon entry into force of the agreement. In terms of services, really is talking about reduction of market access restrictions on service suppliers, and it covers a wide range of services sectors. In the case of Singapore, for example, our service suppliers can look forward to more access into Australia's transport distribution services, Mexico's energy and telecom sectors, as well as Canada's professional services sectors. So it is providing preferential access through the removal of limitations such as foreign equity restrictions. In the investment chapter, we are looking at removal of foreign equity restrictions. For example, in the case of the Vietnam market, investors could look forward to removal of restrictions in private healthcare, telecoms, courier services, as well as environmental services. In the area of government procurement, it actually enables companies in IT sectors, construction, and consultancy services to bid for government projects in the different economies. So the chapter will actually set down transparent, objective tender specifications, as well as establish what are some of the domestic procedures if there are disputes in these projects. Thanks. I think Darius also mentioned this concept of regional accumulation. Essentially, when you source materials from the other 10 CPTPP economies, they can be deemed as originating content and qualify for preferential tariffs when the finished good is actually exported to other CPTPP countries. So it actually supports companies in siting your production factories or processes across the CPTPP economies. The next one is actually about customs procedures. It provides simplified customs procedures. Custom laws, regulations, procedures must be made readily available on the internet, and members should strive to avoid unnecessary delays on arrival, as well as ensure shipments are processed within the period no longer than necessary to comply with customs laws. And there are provisions for expedited customs treatments or express delivery shipments as well. For both SBS and TBT chapters, it is more about dealing with international standards as well as risk assessment, so that the measures must be based on this. There is also a consultative mechanism for early as well as expeditious resolution of SBS matters. And the SBS chapter will apply to a wide range of products, including things like wines and of course pharmaceuticals and cosmetics and medical devices for both chapters. Next. This will probably be of some interest to companies. There is an e-commerce chapters, and it ensures that trade is conducted electronically between parties, takes place efficiently, and also with appropriate consumer protection. And some of the elements are listed here. We're talking about free cross-border data as well as information flows, and there's a removal of the localization requirements. Economies are supposed to ensure that there's access to an open internet, as well as online consumer protection and privacy laws. There is also the provision that prohibits forced technology transfer. And the last one is about prohibiting the imposition of customs duties on digital products. IPR, there are rules to help streamline IP transaction, essentially by increasing transparency as well as lower the cost of doing business. And here we're talking about search, register, as well as protecting trademarks as well as patents. And there is the other chapter, which is on state-owned enterprises. It is groundbreaking because in the sense that there are rules aimed at ensuring that these so-called entities make decisions on their own on commercial basis and compete with private entities on a level playing field. There are these provisions on labor, environment, as well as horizontal issues. Essentially, for labor is committing to improve labor standards by adopting a certain ILO declaration. And for the environment chapter, is for the economies to work together to address a range of environmental challenges, such as marine pollution as well as wildlife trafficking. Next. Right. So in 2022, Singapore will be the chair of the CPTPP Commission. The chair actually rotates among the members on a yearly basis. So 2 years ago it was Mexico. This year is Japan, and then of course Singapore will take over the chair in 2022. And the role of the chair essentially is to work with the other members to promote steady implementation of the agreement. So in terms of our priority for next year, really, we want to leverage on the agreement to see how we can continue to facilitate regional economic recovery, as well as to advance cooperation in some key issues, for example, in e-commerce. We want to work with parties to implement the rules in order to help businesses adopt solutions. We're talking about removal of cross-border data flows, removal of customs duties, as well as promote cross-border data flows. On COVID recovery, essentially, we're talking about supply chain resilience. How do we ensure that economies continue to implement the agreement such that, when we talk about regional accumulation, you're able to make use of those accumulation to make sure that your goods will be able to enter the markets, economies on a preferential basis. And then lastly, it's really about environment and working with other members to see how we can come up with initiatives to combat global environmental challenges. So these are some of the key priorities at this stage. And of course, we'll continue to work with other members with feedback from the business and private sectors to see how we can work together to improve the CPTPP. So I think that's all in 10 minutes. I guess I'll be in the next, the second panel and to take questions as well. So back to you, Jason.
Thank you, TJ. I will now invite all panel 1 panelists to please switch on the cameras for our first panel discussion. So we have 3 panelists, and I would first like to introduce Brenda Wales, newly arrived Senior Trade Commissioner at the High Commission of Canada. Prior to arriving in Singapore this year, Brenda was Chief of Staff to Canada's Chief Trade Commissioner. She has previously served in trade policy roles at the embassies of Canada in Mexico City and Washington, D.C., and has represented Canada's Trade Commissioner Service in Colombia and Chile. While on assignment in Canada, Brenda has worked predominantly in the field of trade policy, first on trade negotiations with Europe, then on the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, with a focus on stakeholder engagement and communications. Brenda, can I invite you for your opening remarks, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jason, for that kind introduction. Many thanks to you and the Singapore Business Federation team for inviting me today. I'm pleased to join Carlos and Tianbon on this panel and to have the opportunity to talk about Canada and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. My role as Senior Trade Commissioner, along with all of my colleagues who form part of the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service abroad and in Canada, is to help Canadian businesses grow and export to new markets and to attract investment. The CPTPP provides an important tool to achieve this. This ambitious and inclusive free trade agreement gives Canadian businesses preferential access to the Asia-Pacific region. And as all of us here today know, Asia-Pacific is now the world's leading region of economic growth, offering big opportunities for trade and expansion. The CPTPP is helping to create jobs, strengthen economic relations, and boost Canada's trade with important trading partners. Once fully implemented, CPTPP will form a trading bloc representing 500 million consumers and 13.5% of global GDP, providing Canada with preferential access to key markets in Asia and Latin America. The agreement achieves much more than lowering tariffs. This was touched on in the overview we just heard. And I know the panel discussion will explore this in more detail later, but for now, I'll underscore that it covers virtually all sectors and aspects of trade in order to eliminate or reduce barriers. It covers a wide range of issues such as government procurement, business travel, intellectual property protection, labor and environment, among others. The CPTPP demonstrates Canada's commitment to diversifying trade and investment with key markets around the world and supporting an effective, open, inclusive, and rules-based global trading system. It was also Canada's first FTA with an ASEAN member. And as noted, I've just recently arrived in Singapore. This island nation is a natural entry point and a regional hub for Canadian companies looking to do business in Southeast Asia. I look forward to working with Canadian clients, local companies, the government of Singapore, and organizations such as the SBF to strengthen our commercial relations and increase our two-way trade and investment. Thank you again for the invitation.
All right, Brenda. Next, we have Ms. Wong Toon Joon, trade consultant with various international law firms and the Big Four firm for about 20 years. Toon was formerly an RO negotiator for Singapore and specializes in delivering supply chain and business solutions focusing on customs and regulatory issues. She has worked on various global and regional supply chain restructuring exercises, including global FTA mapping and supply chain optimization programs. Toon, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. Thank you thanks to SBF for inviting me to speak on this panel. Would love to certainly share some of my experiences working with businesses on leveraging FTAs in doing the restructuring of their supply chain, and not just supply chain, but also every other aspects of their business, because FTAs, is not just about tariffs and rules of origin, but increasingly, as Brenda mentioned, there's so much more to FTAs, including especially the CPTPP, which provides a lot of protections and rights for businesses, but at the same time, businesses should also be aware of some of the obligations that may arise because of the agreement. So this is what I would like to, I'm happy to share some of my experiences working on a lot of these supply chain issues. Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Yeah, last but not least, we have Carlos Cui, Senior Analyst at the APEC Secretariat's Policy Support Unit based in Singapore. Now, Carlos deals with projects on trade and investment liberalization, including FTAs and structural reforms. He was a former Peru government official at the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism, where he was the chief negotiator for the Peru-China FTA, general coordinator for the Peru-Singapore FTA, and advisor to the Deputy Minister for Foreign Trade. Carlos, please.
Thank you, Jason, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Singapore Business Federation for the invitation to be part of this panel with Brenda and Changwen. Good afternoon to everyone. And well, I will speak here from the perspective of a former Peruvian and government official involved in the discussions to participate in trade negotiations with the P4 members, which first led us into the TPP and subsequently to the CPTPP. And also I'll speak from the perspective of a senior policy analyst at the APEC Policy Support Unit, where we have published some work analyzing certain areas covered by the CPTPP. So for Peru, I would say that participating in a big Asia-Pacific negotiation like CPTPP or the TPP was a no-brainer. Why? Because you see, Peruvian trade with East Asian, the East Asian region, Australia and New Zealand, was about 23% of that trade, of the total trade in 2007, when the first discussions to join to this negotiation started. And right now, the participation of the Peruvian trade in this region is about 40%. So it's very significant. And you see, I mean, this has been a long process. The initial negotiations the initial discussions to join the negotiations started in 2007. And Peru only announced that it was officially joining the negotiations in November 2008. The negotiations, we know they started in 2010, and the CPTPP was signed in 2018. But in the case of Peru, it was only in July 2021 that Peru was able to ratify the CPTPP in Congress, despite the government not having, a majority in Congress. And in that way, that was reported to New Zealand as a depository of the CPTPP, and only in September, Peru was able to implement it. So you see, it took 14 years. And it was a long process, but it was worth for a number of reasons. You see, TPP, it has a potential market of 500 million people to sell goods and services under preferential treatment. Also, CPP markets purchasing power is very high. And so that's attractive for any party, to expand their exports. Also, it's easier to attract foreign direct investment. It's also easier to obtain preferential treatment because of the accumulation route of origin. But most importantly, the CPTPP has the potential to be the gold standard in terms of trade rules. So for Peru, it was very important to be part of the negotiation of those rules and use those rules also as a chance to implement domestic reforms in Peru. So you can see CPTPP is very, very attractive. We have now 3 non-CPTPP members that are applying for membership. So yeah, it's.
All right, thank you, Carlos, Chimvon, and Brenda. As former trade analyst myself, I'm very glad that we have a panel of technical subject matter experts here, all of whom have negotiated trade agreements here today to discuss how businesses can benefit from CPTPP and how it is different from other trade agreements. So apart from tariff elimination and market access, the CPTPP's high quality provisions on things like e-commerce, investment, financial services, labor, and environment, are also said to have established standards on new rules of the road that will have broad collective impact on global trade regulatory architecture. The recent US-Mexico-Canada agreement, for instance, has drawn on the CPTPP for several of its chapters. So the first question I would like to start the panel off with is for Brenda. I understand you were part of the Canadian government team preparing for the TPP negotiations back then, and I'm interested to know what was the vision of the TPP parties back then. What did they set out to achieve through the agreement, and how did it become the gold standard agreement that we see it as today?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, indeed. I had the pleasure of working on the TPP negotiations, first in my role in the trade policy section at the Embassy of Canada in Washington. And during that time, I was engaged in discussions with the United States as Canada was seeking to join the negotiations. And we certainly wanted to be a part of creating the new rules, this 21st century agreement, similar to what Carlos said about Peru wanting to join, similarly wanted to help shape and form the negotiations. And then when I went to Ottawa, I worked directly with our TPP chief negotiator, Kirsten Hillman, and the two deputy chief negotiators, Nadia Theodore and Danny Carrière, on stakeholder engagement and communications. And as you can imagine, given the ambitious and groundbreaking nature of the agreement, the engagement and consultations with stakeholders in Canada were extensive and increased in frequency as we got closer to concluding the TPP in late 2015. There were debriefing sessions after each round of negotiations and lots of discussions and sharing of information with our 10 provinces and 3 territories. You know, when you're making some new chapters and having groundbreaking provisions, it did require a lot of consultation, a lot of analysis into what would be beneficial to Canada, and then also getting industries, companies, business associations, and of course all the provinces and territories on board, and understanding the balance of commitments and concessions. So it was a fascinating time for me to be working on that. I also worked heavily on the communications products to explain the outcomes and benefits of the TPP so that industries and companies could learn how to take advantage of the provisions of the agreement. And of course, we all know that the TPP then moved into CPTPP, and I had moved on from working with that team before the agreement was reopened and the CPTPP was negotiated and concluded. But once the CPTPP was concluded and entered into force for Canada, this was when the trade negotiators passed the baton to Canada's trade promotion team, known as the Trade Commissioner Service, or the TCS. And at that point, it was for the TCS to promote the benefits and help Canadian companies to take advantage of it. The TCS is a network of over 1,000 international business development professionals located in more than 160 cities around the world that is dedicated to helping Canadian companies succeed in new markets. Here in Singapore, we have a team of 13 supporting the Trade Commissioner Service. And our colleagues in Canada, as well as our Minister of International Trade, conducted extensive outreach across the country in order to ensure that, that the companies, that especially the SMEs, could understand how they could take advantage of the agreement. So promotion really shifted to our focus, and the TCS played such an important role. And we developed training tools and new resources for companies to learn more about the provisions of the agreement and the new market access that was available to them. And one example is we now have a Canada Tariff Finder. This tool helps companies quickly and easily search for tariff rates in markets where Canada has a free trade agreement. The TCS also developed new training programs to educate and inform trade commissioners, so that network of the TCS abroad. So we've had extensive training programs in the CPTPP markets so that we are well equipped to provide advice and guidance to Canadian companies on aspects related to the agreement. So there's no question that the Trade Commissioner Service is dedicated to supporting Canadian businesses of all sizes in all sectors and from all regions of our country so that they can fully realize the benefits from the CPTPP. And it is, as Carlos said, viewed as the gold standard, and we look forward to continuing to take advantage of it and helping grow our trade ties with countries that are members. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Glad you had that unique experience of both doing capital-based analytical work and now, of the ground, helping businesses. And it sounds like there's a lot of similarity with what we are doing as well. Singapore also have a tariff finder for businesses, and what we're here today is to help our businesses gain awareness and utilize FTAs for global competitive advantage. Moving on to Carlos, and just like Brenda mentioned, you said that the CPTPP was a gold standard agreement. Could you share from your perspective which particular aspects of the CPTPP are different from, I guess, more traditional FTAs that therefore given CPTPP this mantle of being called the gold standard agreement?
Thank you, Jason, for your question. Very relevant. Well, to start with, I think CPTPP is offering a single set of rules for trade among 11 parties, and those rules are mostly high standard. For example, going beyond trading goods in services, I think CPTPP provides a strong framework to promote cross-border trading services, deeper market access, national treatment. Also, there is no obligation to have a local presence in a number of sectors in order to provide a service. So we can see that this could benefit services providers in several areas, for example, telecommunications, transportation, energy, consulting, tourism, call centers, distribution centers, software developers. And these are some of the areas that actually are relevant during this pandemic. It will be relevant during after the pandemic is over, during the recovery. At the same time, the CPTPP also allows for temporary entry of business persons, and usually in FTAs, this category covers intracorporate transferees, short-term visitors, business visitors, investors. But in this case, CPTPP also includes the possibility to have professionals and technicians to benefit from this temporary entry, and that's very, very important. Also, CPTPP provides very strong rules on competition policy. The parties are agreeing to maintain competition laws to prohibit anti-competitive business conduct. And as we heard the opening remarks from TA, CPTPP also has groundbreaking rules in state-owned enterprises in a way that the agreement seeks to prevent state-owned enterprises to unduly hamper the free flow of trade. So in a way, SOEs will have to make decisions on a commercial basis and compete with other firms on a level playing field. So, and also this chapter guarantees that SOEs are not discriminating against suppliers from other CPTPP parties. In addition to that, we have we have compulsory rules on labor and environment. For example, the parties cannot lower environmental standards in order to promote trade and investment. Something similar happens with regards to trade. In intellectual property rights, I think CPTPP is establishing a predictable and transparent standard to protect and enforce intellectual property in almost all categories of intellectual property rights. It's also reducing red tape. For example, registered trademarks are protected for 10 years, right? Before the renewal is required. Also, CPTPP has implemented some measures to basically prevent the theft of trade secrets, and that's not something that all FTAs have. And finally, I will end with this example that is about trading goods. Sometimes, some CPTPP members have already bilateral FTAs, but those bilateral FTAs cannot be used to have preferential entry. For example, Peru produces metal gaskets, but the materials for the metal gaskets comes from Japan and Canada, and Peru exports metal gaskets to Mexico. With a bilateral Peru-Mexico FTA, the rule of origin is that the materials must come from either Peru and Mexico. Both of them cannot produce the necessary quality. So with CPTPP now, Peruvian metal gaskets can enter Mexico with preferential treatment. So these are some of the examples that show that CPTPP is the gold standard. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Carlos. Now that we have heaped quite a bit of praise on the CPTPP and how it is, unlike other trade agreements, I would like for us to go a bit more specific and relatable on how does CPTPP benefit our economies and businesses. So Carlos, given your expertise with trade data analysis, how much do we expect economies to grow as a result of CPTPP? Which sectors will benefit most, in your opinion? And apart from market access, how can businesses benefit from the regulatory improvements that we talked about?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. We've done some studies in the ABEC Policy Support Unit, and the CPTPP is going to bring significant benefits. For example, the real income by 2030 in CPTPP members could increase collectively by $158 billion. And among individual parties, that would range between $1 to $46 billion per CPTPP party, depending on the economic sizes, basically. Also, the exports would collectively increase by $300 billion approximately. So the effect would be positive in terms of welfare, in terms of trade, in terms of attracting investments, in terms of production, GDP, and employment, which is very important. The full liberalization is very comprehensive. We noticed that around 86% of the tariff lines, so the products, will enjoy duty-free access immediately on the date of entry into force of CPTPP. So it's 86%. In the case of RCEP, for example, it's much lower. It's about 63%. Still significant, but much lower. Which sectors will be would benefit? I would say it's a lot about capital goods and intermediate products, and that helps you also to strengthen your global value chains. So that's the case of, for example, machinery, mechanical applications, electronic applications, chemicals, iron and steel products, fertilizers, wood, among other products of that kind. If we look at the CPTPP parties, how they are liberalizing, we could say that on year one, at least 98% of the goods will enjoy duty-free treatment or any other preferential treatment. So it's quite significant. There are very few products that are going to be under partial liberalization or are going to be excluded. Only 3 CPTPP members are excluding goods. At most, one of them is excluding 3% of the goods. In RCEP, you have parties that are excluding more than 10%, even 18% of the goods. So it's very different. But in terms of other benefits, for example, in terms of customs procedures, I mean, CPTPP is helping to simplify customs procedures and apply the procedures in a very consistent and transparent manner, right? For example, the clearance of goods must be done in a very expedited manner. The commitments to release a normal trade has to be in 48 hours. The express shipments in 6 hours only. And also, it's very important here, CPP parties have the obligation to implement risk assessment techniques, in customs. So in that way, that could facilitate, the release of goods. Not everything has to be inspected on site before being released. And there are also benefits, from the investment side with investment clauses and And also, CPTPP is preventing that parties could implement non-tariff measures like export restrictions, import restrictions, subsidies, export subsidies to agricultural goods. And so those benefits go to many different goods and sectors. Yeah.
Right. You're absolutely spot on, Carlos. Thank you so much. Brenda, from the Canadian perspective, how do you think Canadian businesses have benefited from the CPTPP, and has the agreement been useful in creating opportunities for Singapore and Canadian businesses to trade or collaborate?
Yeah, so the CPTPP commits to helping small and medium-sized enterprises to take advantage of the agreement's commercial opportunities, and SMEs represent over 99% of Canadian businesses and almost 90% of all private sector jobs in Canada. And the CPTPP can benefit Canadian SMEs by enhancing their ability to participate in and benefit from the opportunities flowing from the agreement. It does this by creating advantageous conditions for SMEs by eliminating tariffs on 99% of current Canadian exports to CPTPP countries and providing enhanced access for service providers. It also offers a single set of high standard rules for trade across the Asia Pacific region, making trade more predictable, transparent, and accessible. It addresses key challenges and barriers to doing business in the global marketplace, such as technical barriers to trade, the cost of which disproportionately affects SMEs. It enhances market access for Canada's services and financial services industries, and provides a comprehensive set of investment protection measures backed by a robust mechanism for resolving investment disputes. And Carlos has touched on some of these already. It also lowers the costs of participating in international trade, including by the creation of new rules that address potential barriers to digital trade and protect the free flow of data across borders. It simplifies procedures for clearing goods through customs. Carlos mentioned that, including, by making specific commitments to enhancing transparency and making information available online for SMEs. It promotes fair business practices and creates a level playing field with enforceable rules on state-owned enterprises. We heard that as well. And whether a Canadian company sells goods or services, or if they're seeking new business partners in their supply chain, the CPTPP can help them grow their global sales by increasing competitiveness with lower tariffs or no tariffs. It costs less to take Canadian products or services to the Asia Pacific region, especially in markets where Canada previously faced high tariffs, such as Japan and Vietnam. Once CPTPP is fully implemented, 99% of CPTPP markets tariff lines will be duty-free. By providing access to new customers, CPTPP makes it easier for Canadian companies to reach markets and bid on opportunities. It also makes foreign markets more transparent and stable. And I think this is one area where, the trade team here in Singapore can help to encourage Canadian companies to come here to use Singapore as their base in order to take advantage of opportunities in nearby member countries. The CPTPP offers Canadian business better predictability, protection, transparency. And then, as Carlos also mentioned, enforceable rules in the areas of international labor, environmental standards. The agreement also improves access for service providers. Carlos mentioned some of the temporary entry provisions, which make it easier for certain highly skilled professionals, such as engineers and senior managers, to work temporarily in the Asia Pacific. There's also better predictability and transparency in service sectors, electronic commerce, financial services, and telecommunications. And lastly, it provides support to SMEs through a dedicated SME chapter to help them explore and navigate CPTPP markets and better position themselves for success. And this was, the first time that Canada had ever included a chapter like this in one of its FTAs. I think the key here for Canadian companies and us promoting the CPTPP to them and encouraging them to do more business in Singapore, it revolves more about the certainty and predictability that the agreement provides, and the trade facilitation that it provides, and particularly, as I mentioned, given the high concentration of Canadian SMEs, the easier that we can make it for them to do business, the more likely they're going to expand and explore other markets. And Singapore is just an ideal place, as I said, to first enter the ASEAN region and to take advantage of the CPTPP and then expand further to other member countries.
All right, thank you, Brenda. And we hope the CPTPP can be a good platform for our Canada-Singapore bilateral trade to continue growing, for bilateral investment to continue, especially as a gateway to the rest of Southeast Asia. And so on the topic, Chen Von, thank you for your patience. I would now like to kind of zoom in more on Singapore businesses. For those in the audience, how can Singapore businesses benefit from this agreement, in your opinion? And from your experience, which particular areas of the agreement should they pay attention to?
Well, thanks, Jason. I think the Brenda and Carlos, and of course, just now Toon Joon has mentioned that there are the traditional areas of the FTAs that appear, in terms of market access, rules of origin, and so on and so forth. And then there are the new areas. So for me, I advise companies on what to do with FTAs. What we see is that besides the traditional ideas, especially if we look at the type of businesses that are evolving, the type of industries and the products that are evolving in Singapore right now. So we have the therapeutics, we have the pharmaceutical companies, we have the protein, companies that make protein products, right? So these, besides the market access, besides tariffs, besides origin, what is very interesting for me, at least under when I look at CPTPP, is not just about how Singapore businesses can move our goods outside and can export our goods to new markets like Mexico and Canada, because these are the two territories where CPTPP provides a new avenue for preferential trade. But at the same time, it's that even when we move goods traditionally, it's all about tariffs and origin. But now more and more, because of the value add in terms of the intellectual property, the innovation that is being done in Singapore, when Singapore goods now move overseas, we have that added protection, not just in terms of cost savings, but now we also have the added protection of intellectual property when we are moving a lot of our innovative products to overseas market, to CPTPP markets. So I think so this is one area that I see potentially. It's not just about reducing costs, but it's also about protecting what is of value to a lot of our Singapore businesses right now, and that is in terms of the intellectual property protection. The other area that I see as we've seen is in terms of the digital. Again, a lot of digital innovations are being done out of Singapore, and a lot of it is and for a lot of our goods, even if we are selling across to different markets, right? Consumer preferences, understanding how our goods are doing in foreign markets, those are important and critical data that will help our business expand as well, because we then would be able to better understand how our products and our businesses are doing in overseas markets. And so with this the digital provisions under the CPTPP, we can be quite assured that a lot of what we see in overseas markets, the kind of data that we gather in overseas markets on our consumer preferences, on the reception that our products and services get overseas, all these can come back to Singapore to give us added value when we see. So I see the CPTPP not, the different chapters and different provisions would not be seen in isolation, should not be seen in isolation as in, we are only looking at market access in terms of tariffs or origin, but also in the other chapters, the other provisions on what added value can the CPTPP have for Singapore businesses. And I think these are some of the very quick these areas that would be of critical importance, especially to a lot of our new innovative businesses that are starting up, that are evolving in Singapore. And not just that, these are all the innovations that are being done. And we also have companies that are seeking to invest overseas, produce, manufacture their products overseas, or even engaging OEM companies, OEM manufacturers overseas. And all these would actually help. And when companies move overseas, it's always useful to not just know what is their rights, but also what their obligations are and how they can be protected. And this would come in the form of under the investment protections. It would be very useful for Singapore business when venturing overseas to know how they can protect themselves and in what aspects can the CPTPP provide certain level of protection for them in the CPTPP markets. So I think these are all very, very useful provisions that are provided under CPTPP, and that Singapore businesses should really, I know sometimes it's very dry to read the text, the legal text, but it will be very useful, and they can of course reach out to SBF or ESG to seek assistance, or even to come to consultants like myself to talk through what may be possible, and to take a more, I would say, a more holistic view of the possibilities, rather than, of course, you know, if you're just thinking about doing export or import trade, that's fine, and then that's fair, and that's what CPTPP provides, a lot of opportunities for businesses as well. But at the same time, if we are trying to expand and we are talking about a holistic expansion overseas, then I think there are a lot of venues, a lot of provisions under the CPTPP that would be of great help to Singapore businesses.
Thank you for your insights, Chen Von, and glad to hear that you have helped businesses utilize FTAs to enter new markets, or even to internationalize for the first time. If you don't mind us diving in a bit deeper, as you and the audience know very well, Singapore has more than 20 FTAs, and there are some significant overlaps for certain markets, particularly those in Southeast Asia and Oceania. So how would you advise businesses on how they can assess the different FTAs and decide on which FTA they should use?
I know it's all very confusing because there are so many options. The more choices you have, the more confused you get. Indeed. Right? Yeah, but I think what is useful to first for companies to start off, what is it that they are trying to achieve, right? If are they only looking at a single market, or are they looking at multiple markets, right? And besides markets and destination for their products, what about upstream? Right? Where are they importing from? Where are they buying? Where are they sourcing their raw materials, their parts and components from? Because we are not just looking at the end markets. And like Carlos mentioned just now, you know, if you are sourcing from other countries that are not covered under other agreements, for example, then the particular FTA may not be very useful for the company. So what we need to do is actually to look at the entire supply chain, to look at what is possible. So there are two starting points for businesses, and usually that's what we advise companies to do. Number one, you have to really know your own supply chain, right? Who you are exporting to, which country, what is your destination markets, of course, and where are you sourcing from? So both upstream and downstream, you must know. Right? And then number two is to then map out, according to where you're coming from and where you're going to, map out the FTAs involved. So once you have the FTAs, you know what are the tariffs available. You must know what are the rules of origin that is available to you. Right? Of course, a plurilateral, more than one country, if an FTA involves more than one country, of course that will be of a better it gives you better options in terms of sourcing than a bilateral FTA, of course, right? But if your sourcing comes outside of the FTAs, then then anything else goes. So it really depends, but it is necessary to do that tool mapping and then to see the overlap before you decide. And I think there are a lot of services out there. SBF, I know, provides consultative services. I know ESG has the MRA, FTA advisory grants available that companies can tap on to get FTA support. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Chien-Von, and also Brenda and Carlos for your time today and your expert insights. I had wished to talk more about the ongoing work and unfinished work of the CPTPP, and we could probably spend an entire day discussing CPTPP in great detail, but unfortunately that is all the time we have for today. We have to now move on to panel 2 on the future of CPTPP. So you may know that Singapore is hosting the CPTPP Commission next year amidst strong interest from a number of economies to join this agreement. So it is exciting times ahead for the future of both CPTPP and the regional trade regulatory architecture. Elizabeth Chelier, Principal Trade Specialist at MTI, will moderate this panel. So this is one of the most experienced trade negotiators in Singapore, and is an institution of trade policy knowledge herself. She's a well-known name in the trade policy circuit and probably needs no further introduction. So with a thank you to our speakers and panelists, Liz, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Jason, especially for that very flattering introduction. I have been in the circuit for quite some time, so let's see how we take this session forward. So just before I introduce my fellow panelists for this session, can I just do a quick recap? So this panel 2, we are looking into what next, what is the future for CPTPP. So as we heard Toon Joon in his overview say, what does it offer to business today? So it's trying to deal with current and emerging business challenges. You know, all your earlier speakers in the earlier panel have touched upon the benefits arising from the common rule book, from the accelerated tariffs, from the different ways of looking at rules of origin and therefore enhancing qualification to take part and benefit from preferential trade. Then not forgetting all the important innovations and steps that have been taken for services, in particular for digital services. So then with such a robust agreement already in play, what else then can we look forward to for businesses to help them navigate the current, especially COVID supply chain? So Toon Joon mentioned that will be one of the issues that Singapore will be taking forward as part of our chairmanship year. And also, what are the issues that will be developed or you would like to see developed, you know, in this quasi-common rule book? So we will get the views of our panelists, but I also encourage the audience to respond on the Q&A with your aspirations or points that you would like to see TPP address. So if I may first introduce the panel. So Toon Joon, I do not need to reintroduce because he's already been introduced before and he's spoken, but he's a close friend. We've both been doing and working on the trade circuit for a very long time. And then we have 3 other panelists for you. We have Henry Gao, who is an Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. With law degrees from 3 continents, he started his career as the first Chinese lawyer at the WTO Secretariat. He is widely published on issues relating to China and the WTO and has advised many national governments as well as the WTO and World Bank on trade issues. He sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program. So you can see, you know, that Henry will be the one that for anybody who has burning questions about why China is interested in joining CPP and how that will fare, these are the questions you can direct to Henry. Jared Ragland is also an old friend from way back. You know, one of my colleagues said that we are like a trade mafia. We keep on meeting each other all the time. So I met Jared when he was working for the United States government, but now he's in the private sector. He serves as Senior Deputy Policy APAC at Business Software Alliance, the software alliance working with BSA members. He develops international strategies to open markets and promote innovation and digital trade in important foreign markets in the Asia-Pacific region, which includes most of the CPTPP members. So again, I will be turning to Jared to talk about what next in terms of the digital. Already CPTPP is very innovative, as the earlier panelists have pointed out, and what is being done to provide a rule book to guide this emerging sector for businesses, emerging a lot now during COVID. So let's see what other aspirations we would like to see in TPP. And then we have Natalie Black, who was appointed Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Asia Pacific, covering Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australasia in September 2018. Natalie has held a number of posts in Her Majesty's government. Previous roles include Deputy Head of the Number 10 Policy Unit, Director of the Internet Harris Unit, and Director of the Office of Cyber Security Cabinet Office. So again, someone with a lot of digital background, but you know, as UK has already started their accession process to the CPP, that will be the focus of my questions to her to speak about. So without further delay, let me turn to the panelists. Let me first start with Toon Joon. You know, you said that if you can just give us a bit more insights into what you aspire to see CPTPP doing in helping business on the emerging business challenges. Toon Joon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. So I've actually spoken earlier about, you know, the overview of the CPTPP. So maybe I could just quickly make 3 points for this particular session. First, of course, and this point has been reiterated by a number of the panelists previously as well, that CPTPP continues to be a flag bearer FTA, right? It is a modern agreement with new and refreshed rules for cross-border trade and investment, a 21st century or a gold standard FTA. I mean, various sort of description has been made about the FTA, so I won't go further into that. The second point that I want to make really is that the CPTPP is meant to have an open and inclusive architecture. So basically, it is open to any economy that is able to meet its high standards, prepared to meet its high standard, willing to meet its high standard, to have the chance to negotiate its accession into the CPTPP. So as you mentioned earlier, beyond the 11 current members or signatories of the CPTPP, we now have the process of accession process for the UK. We just started middle of this year. And of course, there have been other requests from other economies to join the CPTPP. So the idea really is to have this open architecture to welcome more economies into the agreement, such that, you know, you create sort of a network effect. And of course, the more economies in there, the more beneficial it will be to the businesses. And really, it is open. Of course, all the businesses will be able to access and benefit from the provisions of the agreement. And it will be especially important in this particular climate, where you see, you know, economies taking protectionist measures or unilateral measures, that having such an agreement will help to maintain a certain level of market access, as well as the regulatory predictability for businesses. The third point that I would like to make is really about the possibility for the review of the agreement. So in the area of supply chains, for example, there is actually a provision in the CPTPP for members to review the extent to which the agreement has facilitated the development, the strengthening, as well as the operations of supply chains in the free trade area since you know, it came into effect. So I think that is a process where the members will have to continue to undertake and see, you know, what more can be done to increase the supply chain resilience in the region. Separately, of course, you know, in the provision, there is also one that allows the Commission to review the actual economic relations as well as the partnership among the parties, and to consider ways to further enhance trade and investment between the parties. So if there is agreement among all the parties of the CPTPP, then we can continue to look to improve the provisions of the agreement and see how it can continue to benefit businesses. So like I said, as the chair of the CPTPP Commission next year, we are also kind of thinking through what could be some of the areas that we can continue to work with other members to work on. And I mentioned e-commerce. Earlier this year, the parties agreed to establish a committee on e-commerce. So basically, that committee will then have to look into how we can implement the e-commerce chapter of the CPTPP. And again, how do we do it in such a way that businesses could continue to benefit? The other two areas I've already mentioned, like supply chains as well as environmental chapter. Are there more things that members can do together? So maybe I'll stop here for now. I think we have a lot of other distinguished panelists, and I'll be happy to hear and very interested to hear their views. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you very much, Toon Joon. Can I now turn to Jared? As Toon Joon has already mentioned, a committee on e-commerce has just been established this year. You are working in this field. What aspirations would you like to see happening in CPTPP, as well as maybe touching on what CPTPP chapters in this area already do to form what the earlier panel talked about as a common rule book to facilitate development in this area? Jared, over to you.
Well, thank you. And it's really an honor to be on this panel with you, Liz, and with all the other distinguished panelists. Yeah, I was just thinking back to, nearly 20 years ago when we were doing APEC, and I was a fresh-faced new person into this field, and now I'm literally a graybeard. I currently represent BSA, the Software Alliance, which represents enterprise software companies that provide global services, cloud computing, security, and things of the sort. And this industry is extremely supportive of the CPTPP, especially around the provisions that you just mentioned, Liz, on e-commerce, but also on standards and services and investment, and across the board. In addition, I was a negotiator with USTR for several years, early on in the TPP space, where I was a negotiator on the intellectual property chapter. So I have two big personal and professional reasons to be both excited about the opportunities of the CPTPP and very frustrated with my home government, the United States, for its withdrawal from the agreement in 2017. Someone mentioned earlier that the CPTPP was a no-brainer for their economy, which some might say describes the current and previous administration's approach to this agreement. But fortunately, the CPTPP does not depend on the United States. Singapore and the other members are carrying it forward, which is fantastic. It remains, as many people have said, a near gold standard agreement. And as other countries look to join it, it's just going to become increasingly important for businesses in the region and around the world, frankly. So to get to the specific points, I mean, I think there are a couple themes I'd like to sort of flesh out in this conversation, and I'll just sort of touch on them, and then we can discuss whichever ones people want to going forward. But one theme is just, since a trade agreement is a snapshot in time, we started negotiating the CPTPP 10 years ago, developments, regional and global developments move forward. And so we do need to think about processes to continually update either the implementation or even maybe the structure of the agreement, as Toon Joon just mentioned, is a possibility. And in that context, I think it's really important for governments, all of the CPTPP governments, to do what Singapore and several others already do really well, which is to consult with interested stakeholders throughout this process. BSA and our members have a truly global perspective on the trade and economic dynamics related especially to the digital infrastructure. And so we are really happy that we've been invited to be able to participate in providing advice to governments on the CPTPP. implementation going forward. Just very briefly on, what does the CPTPP do really well, and what could it do more looking forward? I don't want to reiterate all the things that the CPTPP does really well. Like I said, it's a near gold standard, and I say near for a reason, but it's a near gold standard agreement on a lot of things. It was the first major agreement to include enforceable rules around digital trade, server localization. It introduces really strong intellectual property provisions, including around the protection of source code. These kinds of things are just really, really important. One of the things that, because it's a snapshot though, and time, and the environment moves on, there are certain elements that I wouldn't call them out of date, but there are certain agreements that have actually already moved the ball forward, looking at CPTPP as the floor. I remember when I started looking at trade, Singapore-US FTA was the gold standard until Australia came around, and then Korea, and then finally TPP. So there's always going to be a new gold standard coming up. And from the digital trade provisions, we look to combinations of the Singapore digital economy agreements that are being negotiated, the US-Japan digital agreement, and as people have already mentioned, the USMCA, as sources of, sort of even more ambitious and pro-digital trade provisions. And I can go into some of the details that distinguish the USMCA provisions, for example, from the TPP. But in short, it's a little bit more clear on what the exceptions do and don't allow. It creates a little bit more clarity around which sectors are included in the obligations related to digital services and the data transfer requirements. Data transfer related provisions, especially with those with respect to the financial services sector. It extends protections beyond source code to algorithms, which is really, really important as we move into a world where artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly important. And another one that probably doesn't get as much play as it should is that the USMCA takes a step forward to really strongly encourage governments to provide to the public data that they control and possess. A lot of government data is not sensitive, it's not personal, but it gets locked up as things do in governments. But yet it's a really valuable resource if it can be made available, especially in machine readable form for private sector and other individuals to utilize. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more I could say, but again, this is a really exciting and timely conversation, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you very much, Jared, for those insightful views. Before we delve further, let me first hand over to Natalie to take us through as to why did the UK decide to apply to accede to the CPTPP, and how has your experience of that been so far? Natalie, please.
Hi Liz, thank you so much for the opportunity to join this panel. It's a stellar group and I'm so pleased to see some friendly faces. I'm actually talking to you from London, so good morning. I'm taking advantage of the vaccinated travel lane, so a big thank you to our friends at MTI for getting us moving again. It's a big week in UK trade, so just indulge me for a second because there's a couple of things I'd like to share. We had our Global Investment Summit here on Monday, where the PM launched our new green plan, and we had the likes of Bill Gates here to support us. We're also hosting the G7 trade ministers today, and I don't want to give you any spoilers, but I'm pretty confident we're going to be able to say some exciting things in the digital space, so please do watch that. And yesterday we signed our new free trade deal with our very good friends in New Zealand. So that just gives you a bit of a context of how much is going on, but perhaps most importantly for our good friends at SBF and for all of you, I'm also, you'll be glad to hear, been doing some work on our digital economy agreement with Singapore while here in London. So again, I hope we'll be able to say something on that very soon. The reason why I share all those sort of little headlines is just to give you a context of how much we are doing in the trade space, but particularly, of course, in the Indo-Pacific region. You know the headline stats. Half of GDP growth is expected to come from the Indo-Pacific in the next 30 years, and import demand is expected to quadruple. So it's not surprising at all that this is where the trade action is happening. And of course, CPTPP is the heart of that. And we would, as the UK, very much like to be part of that growth story. You know, our strategic commitment to global free trade is something that I think we share with many countries in CPTPP, and of course our particularly good friends in Singapore. But from our perspective, CPTPP is more than a trade deal. It's about setting out what kind of country the UK wants to be going forward. You know, I go back to what Toon Joon was saying, in terms of being open and engaged. The UK is investing very heavily in our deep relationships across the region. We've just become a dialogue partner of ASEAN, the first new one in 25 years. But I think the reason why we are particularly committed to CPTPP is not only that emphasis on free and open trade, but as I say, what it says about more of the kinds of relationships that we want going forward, and particularly on some of the difficult issues that Jared alluded to. Of course, there are huge opportunities on the digital agenda, but there are a lot of challenges as well. And we hope that we bring a wide experience that can contribute to tackling some of those. And of course, on the sustainability agenda as well. I mean, ultimately, the UK is a market of 66 million consumers with the 5th largest market economy by GDP. So we hope that we bring a lot of opportunities for CPTPP members. And in return, we want to be a strong advocate of free trade, constructive and an active member. And this is a particular moment, I think, to say thank you to all the members of CPTPP who have been working so hard to get us through the process really remarkably quickly, right? In terms of, we had our first accession working group meeting only last month after first putting our application in June. So I think the pace is impressive and is a testament to how hard everyone is working behind the scenes. The Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for the Department for International Trade, our Foreign Secretary, couldn't be any clearer that CPTPP is an absolute priority for us. And so we're investing the resources and time to make sure that we are meeting all the high standards of CPTPP, which of course we absolutely support and will continue to do so. I'm sure that's more than enough from me, but I'm very much looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Let me now turn to Henry. Henry is someone who has been closely following China's economic and trade strategies. He has written an article recently in Nikkei Asia on China's entry to the CPTPP trade pact is closer than you think. So I look to him as the expert on all things relating to China and the elephant in the room. And I can see from some of the questions already being raised is about China acceding to CPTPP. So I turn the floor to Henry to give us some of his views on this issue. Henry.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to SBF for kindly inviting me to share some of my thoughts on this issue. So in the short time available, I will first address 3 questions. The first question is China seriously in its application? And second one is, can China meet the high standards, or some would call the gold standards of the CPTPP? And last one is, what will happen next? So for the first question, you know, when China submitted its application earlier, many people were actually quite skeptical, because we were seeing that, you know, China was just doing this as a strategic move. But for me, someone who has been following China's trade policy for many years, I do not think this is really a kind of a spontaneous decision, but I would argue that actually it took a long discussion and internal debate before they decided to submit. So if you look at China's interaction with the CPTPP, actually since 2013, China has already been studying the CPTPP. I mean, I personally have been involved in many sessions involving MOFCOM officials whereby we debate, different aspects of the CPTPP, whether or not China could join and so on. And if you look at this year, actually the process intensified. For example, in January, MOFCOM appointed, formally appointment came from the State Council. It appointed the international trade representative, which is a ministerial rank official that is, second only to the Minister of Commerce, that would be in charge of negotiation of trade agreements for China. And this position has been vacant for more than 2 years. And I think the very act of appointing somebody means that we were going to do something major. And at that time, I suspected it's going to be the CPTPP. And later, when MOFCOM actually published the translated text of all the CPTPP chapters on its website, I think my suspicion was kind of confirmed. And this was confirmed later by China's formal bid to the CPTPP. And actually, as we are holding this webinar here today, in Geneva, another important meeting is also, and that is China's trade policy review, is eighth trade policy review in the WTO, whereby actually China's remarks also refer to as application to the CPTPP as evidence of its willingness to advance regional economic integration and to liberalize trade and investment. So I think regardless of what you think, China's application is really a positive sign. And China, after it submitted its application, is also speeding up its work. And actually, just about a month ago, Lisa and I, we both participated in this webinar organized by the IMF for the senior officials in the Chinese government, mostly from the NDRC of China, where we discuss all aspects of the CPTPP, and I think they are really interested in these issues. So that is the first question. So my answer is basically China is serious this time. Now the second question is, can China meet the high standards? Well, again, there's a lot of skepticism from all circles. But if you really look at the details of the CPTPP agreement, I would argue that actually the gap between the CPTPP rules and China's existing international obligations are not that wide. I will just use digital trade as an example, because that is one area that I spend a lot of time on these days. So if you look at digital trade rules, I mean, I heard from so many people that the CPTPP chapter on e-commerce, is impossible for China to meet. But it is worth pointing out that China actually has already accepted CPTPP-like provisions with the key two terms, that has been pushed by the US: free flow of data across the border, and also prohibition of data losses. China already accepted them in the RCEP, which was concluded last year. I mean, it is true that the RCEP lags behind the CPTPP in several areas. So, for example, the RCEP does not ban the forced transfer. But if you look at the forced transfer source code, it is mostly found in the banking sector and also the goods and services for governmental use. And guess what? If you look at the CPTPP rules in detail, CPTPP itself actually has also carved out both financial services and government procurement from the application of this chapter on e-commerce. So I would argue actually on digital trade, I don't think the gap is that wide. So finally, the final question is, what will happen next? Well, even though China filed the application, even though the gap is wide, but entering the CPTPP will require the consensus of all existing members. And this would include some members which are not really on a really friendly terms with China. Again, I would refer to the China's trade policy review ongoing in Geneva as an example, where, for example, if you look at the statement from Canada, currently in the current review refer to patterns regarding China's willingness to deploy economic coercive measures to block or hinder trade in response to political disagreements. And this is in stark contrast to what Canada said 3 years ago in China's last trade policy review, in which Canada thanked China for its engagement and the hard work and wished the Chinese delegation a safe journey home. So it was like a talk between friends, and this time it's definitely very different. And similar things happened to Australia. Australia's last statement in 2018 was filled with compliments like words like encourages, appreciates, and welcomes China. But this time around, Australia has been calling China, for doing all these things on arbitrary basis, unwarranted delays, and also unjustified anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So the mode has completely changed in 3 years. So the application process would take quite some time to sort out. But I'm optimistic in that I think that they would realize that if the US is not getting in, then China probably will be the biggest market for the existing CPTPP members, and it would not be wise for them to pass up China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for that very insightful and bringing us into the geopolitics. So as with all trade agreements, especially for a session where you need consensus and there's a working process, current geopolitics tensions that you've highlighted on with Canada and Australia could slow down China's accession to CPTP in terms of, because everything needs to be decided by consensus by the CPTPP parties. I recall that even UK had some initial hiccups on this because of tensions that had been taking place with Australia and New Zealand in their own bilateral. But I was glad to hear from Natalie that that had been overcome and they've signed the agreement with New Zealand just now. So perhaps with some patience, we can see how this consensus can be achieved for China acceding to CPTPP. I noticed that there's a question on the question and answer board asking also about Taiwan's application to CPTPP. So I will take that question myself only because I was fortunate or unfortunate, as you want to look at it, to be in Geneva at the time that both China and Chinese Taipei were acceding to the WTO, and the amount of geopolitics that was behind that, to look into the one China policy to make sure that at the end of the day, China actually got the ministerial declaration a few hours, a half day before Chinese Taipei, and therefore they entered into the WTO early. So it's too early now, I would say, to see how that would play out, because as with China having all these geopolitics in terms of getting consensus for them to be part of the CPTPP accession, and then they have to follow all the rules of procedure. We are even a few steps behind on Chinese Taipei, Taiwan, because nothing much has been done yet. So for businesses which are interested, watch the space, see what is going to happen. It is way too early now, but just remember that whatever is done formally in the CPTPP Commission has to be done by consensus. It is not just because Singapore is the chairmanship that Singapore has the ability to take majority decisions. No, it's still by consensus. So any ripples that you hear, like Henry has already pointed out, by Canada and Australia vis-a-vis China could also then impact what is happening later on this accession issue. There was another question on a session about Malaysia. We hear that they are trying to finish their domestic process. We are also watching to see what happens with vis-a-vis RCEP, because we hear from some corners that they're trying to do both together. So again, we don't have the crystal ball. We've been hoping for Malaysia to come and get ready, but you see with all their politics and dynamics that's happening, it's a bit harder. So again, I would just say watch that space on these accessions in terms of new membership, watch through. And maybe I would just turn back to Natalie, since we are talking about the accession process, to see how have they been finding this process so far. You just had your working group meeting last month. Are there any insights? Are you, still as positive to joining the TPP, or do you realize that there's a bit more homework to be done? So what can business expect, especially business in Singapore, where we already have the UK-Singapore FTA in play?
Well, thank you very much. I must say, real kudos to Japan in terms of managing our accession working group. This is the first time that anyone's been put through this process. And again, the amount of time and effort that they are putting in behind the scenes to just make sure the process and the bureaucracy is working is greatly appreciated. For our application, I think it's fair to say it's pretty mundane and boring, actually, from a bureaucratic point of view, because there is so much investment going into the preparation, as I say. So I obviously can't give too many details in terms of what was discussed in the accession working group, but I think all parties came away feeling very upbeat and buoyant by the fact that, one, it has happened so quickly, and two, that it's been able to cover so much ground and in a very positive way amongst all partners. That said, the UK is very, very careful not to take anything for granted. So we will continue to listen to feedback, advice, both, of course, from my fellow civil servants, but of course the business community as well, because although we hope that we will move at pace, of course the key thing is making sure that we realise the benefits of CPTPP at pace. So we need to take the business community along with us, and so in the coming months, I think you'll see a lot more from us in the UK in terms of talking to the business community about this. And I would just make a standing offer, particularly to the Singapore business community, who we have excellent relationships with. Whenever you think it would be useful to hear from us in terms of how we would like to work together on this opportunity, then please do just get in touch, and of course very keen to do that in partnership with MTI. As you say, we already have an FTA with Singapore that we rolled over as a continuity agreement as we left the European Union, but that was obviously negotiated pre-CPTPP. So CPTPP really is a step up in our relationship, and that, combined with the digital economy agreement, we think really sort of sets the standard of not only thought leadership on trade policy around the world, but also on practical cooperation. And so going back to my earlier point, this is all about how can we work with business going forward. And please do get in touch whenever you think there's an opportunity for us to share what insights we can, but also talk about how we are going to implement this practically and quickly.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That's very assuring. I think SBF and MTI might just take you up on that offer going forward. Thank you.
Yes.
If I can now, Toon Joon, you like to make a comment?
May I just add to what Natalie has mentioned? I think one of the points that came across is, of course, the UK's accession is really the first accession that the parties are encountering. So it is kind of like the parties are also trying to find what is the best way forward, because essentially this is going to, set a precedent for future accessions to the CPTPP as well. I think in that sense, we are kind of very appreciative of the UK's efforts, because we gave them a big document to kind of ask them many questions about the UK's legislation, how it can comply with the provisions of the CPTPP, and I think the UK did their homework. They came back to us. I would say that that process is still ongoing. We had the first accession working group, but there are continuing to have expert level sort of technical discussions on specific chapters where we will need to have further discussion with the UK. So definitely work is ongoing, but we will be hoping that that can conclude quite quickly in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Toon Joon, for that elaboration as well. I was going to then turn back to Jared, because we keep on hearing, even Henry talked about China, the digital, Natalie talked about digital. So, digital is seeming to be the issue of the day. And the fact that we are conducting this webinar digitally just reinforces that. So I was going to go back to Jared to see, is there any of the list of gold standard, near gold standard achievements that you would like to see happening? Would you like to elaborate on any of it a bit more? Jared?
Well, sure. I mean, I think again, there are a lot of details around everything from, you know, e-signatures to to sort of paperless documentation and things like that. But the really core advance in the CPTPP, from our perspective, is the requirement not to impose data transfer restrictions and not to impose server localization requirements. Now, of course, every provision in an FTA is subject to exceptions for certain specific and legitimate purposes, as are those. And I would say this is my effort to sort of segue to some of what Professor Gao was talking about, because you're right. The RCEP provisions around digital trade are actually very good. You know, they prohibit generally the same things that the CPTPP does and other advanced agreements. A big difference between the RCEP and the CPTPP is the exceptions. Essentially, in the RCEP, you can self-declare as a member of the RCEP that your privacy or other rules are necessary and sufficient to derogate from your obligations. Whereas there's a higher standard in the CPTPP. You have to demonstrate to the satisfaction of other parties that you're taking the least trade restrictive approach and that your obligations are required. Now, for the trade geeks in the space, I will point out that one of the areas that I would like to see improved over time, but this is going to be over the objections of some of the members, is that the exceptions language on this in the CPTPP uses slightly different language than the standard GATS exceptions language, which makes me wonder if there was ever a dispute whether we could then look to WTO precedent. And the way I'm thinking about it is basically the CPTPP uses the word required, GATS uses necessary. To me, as an English speaker, those two words are the same, but as a judge on a panel, you might say, well, the negotiators could have chosen the same word, they chose a different one, so there must be some difference. So we don't really like that, but dispute settlement is relatively rare in FTA, so it's not a huge deal. But what is a huge deal is the standard by which parties in the CPTPP will hold each other to their commitments and will ensure that the exceptions and limitations language are not abused. That includes for existing rules. So for example, in Vietnam, there are rules that are already maybe out of compliance with the CPTPP, but there was a negotiated transition period. Fair enough. But when the transition period expires, you know, there's a big question. What will Singapore, Australia, the UK, if you get into the club, what will you all do when that exception period expires? And for new entrants, you know, China or any others, Korea could be another one, Philippines. If you're going to take and hold new acceding members to their commitments, and that is something that the business community is going to watch very carefully, because if the exceptions swallow the rule, then the rules don't mean very much. And the real advantage of the CPTPP, the groundbreaking nature of it in the digital trade context, were the enforceable and limited limited exceptions of meaningful advanced digital trade provisions. So that is something that we're going to be looking at very carefully going forward. While I'm not going to say whether I think China should or should not become a member of the TPP in the future, I think that question about whether their existing rules are in accordance with the standards of the CPTPP and the e-commerce chapter would be a huge test for the members on how seriously they are going to take those provisions and how broadly they are going to interpret the exceptions.
Thank you very much, Jared. I think, you know, in this day and age of agility, you know, where businesses want to have the flexibility of knowing how to structure their processes and how data is becoming so essential. You can't do anything without data flows and transfers. So yes, the issue that you pointed out is something that could make TPP, you know, more forward-looking and therefore more enticing for more parties to maybe even join it, seeing how the digital world has just blossomed overnight on the issue about whether current laws are aligned with TPP aspirations and commitments. Again, I would just note back the tediousness of the exercises that we went through during WTO accession processes, where you really need to pay a lot of attention with a fine-tooth comb, ask a lot of questions, and then to see what the way forward will be, you know, and depending on how much trust you have that the acceding country is going to comply, you know. So sometimes an acceding country may have to meet higher hoops than when you're negotiating, because when you're negotiating, everybody is trading off, you know, whereas when you're acceding to the WTO, which is what I'm talking about, is more of a one-way street. So it's an exciting space. So let's see how it goes, and let's see how trade nerds may help to, you know, do the assessment of the laws, which, you know, sometimes poor civil servants have got stretched bandwidth and unable to really pay attention to. There's a question, Toon Joon, in the Q&A that I would like to direct to you, because you had talked about how, as part of the strengthening of the business, we are going to also be looking at supply chain. So Raymond has put in some points about some ideas actually on how you can strengthen the provisions of the trade facilitation chapters to be more prescriptive. I'm just wondering whether you've managed to see the question and whether you have any views as to what he has raised. Again, it touches on trade facilitation for e-commerce shipment and clearances. You know, I think we have some provisions for that under the express shipment provision, but I turn over to you to help Raymond on his question. Toon Joon?
Thanks very much, Liz. I think you're right. Of course, there are provisions on, you know, this trade facilitation in the CPTPP. I suspect what Raymond is asking is, you know, he's encountering some issues on the ground, and whether there is scope for us to relook at some of the current provisions, because he said that, you know, some of it could be too generic. So like I said, I think this is something that, you know, the parties will have to see how we can review, and whether, you know, things are working out on the ground, some of the operations, and how we can continue to strengthen the supply chain resilience. At this stage, I would say that this is probably something that we could take up next year during our chairmanship, like I mentioned. Whether it will result in an outcome where some of the provisions could be revised, I would think maybe not. But if there are companies that are encountering challenges, you know, I think they should approach ESG or NTI with some of their issues, and then we can see how to help companies resolve this on the ground. So that would be my advice at this stage.
Thank you very much, Toon Joon, for that. If I may then turn back to Henry, we have a question, the last question there before, because we're also running out of time, as to a perception from Singapore. So I turn to Henry for your perception, because, you know, it is better to get the private sector perception on this as well. How do you think China and Taiwan's application to CPTPP will change the dynamics of CPTPP? Do you have any views on that, Henry?
Yes, thank you. So on this question, I would say not so much effect for Singapore, because Singapore already have FTAs with both China and Taiwan. You know, Singapore is one of the few countries well, it's the only country in the world I can think of, that has that unique arrangement. So probably not going to change much, but broadly, with China and Taiwan both in the CPTPP and with the accumulation rules under the CPTPP, I think that would definitely make Singapore a more attractive destination for firms when you try to, locate to the region. Now, if I may, I would also like to see something in brief response to Jared's earlier point. I agree with Jared that the exceptions clauses under the CPTPP and RCEP are different when it comes to e-commerce, and also under the RCEP, the dispute settlement chapter does not apply to the e-commerce chapter, unlike the CPTPP. But if you look at the exceptions clauses under the CPTPP, I mean, they are basically modeled after the WTO's exceptions clauses, especially under Article 14 of the GATS. And even though, I mean, the language might appear to be stronger, but if you look at the actual WTO jurisprudence in which they try to, apply this in real cases, as you can see, when it comes to services, actually they give the member being complained against plenty of legal, if you look at the US gambling case, if you look at the China audiovisual products case, they basically would allow the countries to decide and then decide what is necessary. But the key here is the chapeau requirement of non-discrimination, right? And not disguised restrictions on international trade. That is the key. And also another thing I think we have to keep in mind that when we look at the commitments under the CPTPP is that even the commitments under CPTPP on free flow data and the data localization requirements only applies to a covered person when they are supposed to provide for the conduct of the business that is covered under the CPTPP. So if China really has reservations regarding certain sectors, it can just decide not to include that sector in the commitment in the CPTPP without a concern of valid TPP provision. I think that is probably what China is going to do, especially with regard to the media services, which is hypersensitive for China. So if they can carve out that for the other areas, I honestly do not see much problem. But maybe you can discuss it further later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. It looks as though we may need to organize another session with business to see how business is finding how the current CPTPP exceptions are helping or not helping them do their digital business, so that we can put aside for another day. So as I'm wrapping up, any last words from any of the four of you? Toon Joon, do you have any last words before we wrap up?
Thanks very much, Liz. I guess my last words will be to tell businesses that we really value the feedback as to how you can continue to benefit, what role can the government continue to play. So there are feedback channels either through ESG or through MDI. So we will welcome you to provide your feedback to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So business watch the space. We will be reaching out to you all as well. Jared, last words?
I guess the only thing that I haven't gotten to on my list of issues to raise is just, again, to the point that CPTPP is a groundbreaking agreement. We're really looking forward to Singapore and the other governments in consultation with businesses, making sure that that is a floor for future negotiations in the DEAs and in the WTO agreements. For example, the WTO Joint Statement Initiative. It's a fantastic standard that should be met and built upon, and that is what we are advocating kind of across the board on our digital trade agenda. So that's we're always going to be asking for more, I guess, is the summary.
I guess so. Business is what's that, but I just found it a bit interesting. When we do FTA negotiations, we always say the FTA is WTO plus. And now for some of the 21st century issues where there's nothing in the WTO, we are, as you say, maybe looking for it to be CPTPP plus with CPTPP as the ground. So it's in your hands with everybody with the business and negotiators to say how we take this forward. Natalie, I know you're running for another meeting. Do you have any last words?
Well, firstly, just to reiterate the big thanks from the UK. We are very conscious there's a lot of people working hard behind the scenes, particularly Toon Joon and all of his team. So a genuine thank you. We don't take any of that for granted. And secondly, just to reiterate the open offer to engage with business as we move at pace, whether that's in Singapore, anywhere else in the region, and of course here back in the UK. We're really, really keen to have a two-way dialogue and make sure that we all go on this journey together. But thank you very much to SBF, a really great panel.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Henry, you have the final say.
Thank you. I would just steal words from Apple's ad campaign a while ago, where they said the iPhone 6 was bigger and bigger. So I would just say the CPTPP will become bigger and bigger, and it will help your business grow bigger and bigger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the panelists once again and to the participants. And now I'd like to hand over back to SBF to Ivy. Ivy or Jason, I'm not sure who's saying
here.
It.
It's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the webinar. I hope you enjoyed our interactive panel discussion earlier, giving you an insights into the benefits of CPTPP and its upcoming developments. We have also launched the end of the webinar poll, which we appreciate your valuable feedback. Your feedback will help us to create a better experience and improvement for our future events. Should you have any queries relating to FTA, you can email us at fta@sbf.org.sg. Once again, I would like to thank the distinguished speakers for their valuable insights shared, and also thanks the supporting partners for their continuous support for this event. I would like to thank everyone for your time to attend this webinar too. I wish all of you a wonderful weekend ahead. Stay safe and take care. Thank you.